The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. 23 years of military service had taught him many things, but nothing could have prepared him for the events that would unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday in October. Morrison had served under 3 monarchs during his distinguished career. He remembered the nervous excitement of his first royal assignment under Queen Elizabeth II, the uncertainty that followed King Charles's ascension, and now the complex dynamics that had emerged since the new reign began. The Royal Guard had always prided itself on unwavering loyalty to the crown, but recent months had tested that loyalty in ways no one anticipated. The captain's radio crackled to life. "Alpha Team, prepare for arrival of Her Majesty Queen Camilla at the main entrance. Standard protocol applies." Morrison acknowledged the transmission, but something in his chest tightened. The standard protocol had become anything but standard lately. 3 weeks earlier, an incident at Buckingham Palace had sent ripples through the Royal Protection Services. Queen Camilla had requested additional security measures that many guards felt were excessive, and more troublingly, seemed designed to elevate her status above other senior royals. The request had been quietly discussed among the senior officers, creating an undercurrent of unease that had been building steadily. As Morrison positioned himself at his post, he noticed the subtle tension in his fellow guards. Sergeant Williams, a 15-year veteran, stood rigidly at attention, but his jaw was clenched in a way that spoke volumes. Corporal Davies, normally quick with a joke during brief moments between duties, had been unusually silent for days. The entire unit seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something none of them could quite name. The black Bentley rounded the corner precisely on schedule. Through the bulletproof windows, Morrison could see Queen Camilla's profile as she reviewed papers in the back seat. Her security detail had been doubled since the recent adjustments to royal protocol, another decision that had raised eyebrows among the palace staff. The car came to a smooth stop, and Morrison stepped forward to fulfill his ceremonial duties. But as his hand moved toward the car door handle, Morrison hesitated. In that split second, memories flooded back of the conversation he'd had with Princess Anne just 48 hours earlier. The Princess Royal had visited the guards' quarters, something she'd done countless times over the years. But this visit had been different. Her words echoed in his mind. "The crown serves the people, Captain. Never forget that those who wear it are merely custodians of something far greater than themselves." Morrison opened the car door and stepped back, executing a crisp bow as Queen Camilla emerged. She acknowledged him with a brief nod before sweeping toward the castle entrance, her entourage following in careful formation. To any observer, the moment would have appeared entirely normal. But Morrison knew better. He had followed protocol to the letter, yet something fundamental had shifted in how he viewed his role. Later that afternoon, as Morrison completed his shift reports, he received an unexpected summons. Princess Anne wished to speak with him privately in the blue drawing room. Such requests were not unusual, but the timing felt significant. The Princess Royal had always commanded respect among the military personnel, not just because of her royal status, but because of her own military background and her genuine understanding of service. Princess Anne was reviewing documents when Morrison entered. She looked up with the direct gaze that had made her both respected and occasionally feared throughout the royal household. "Captain Morrison," she began without preamble, "I understand there have been some concerns among the guard recently." Morrison maintained his professional composure, but inwardly he was calculating how much the princess knew about the growing tensions. "Your Royal Highness, the guard remains committed to protecting all members of the royal family," he replied carefully. Princess Anne set down her papers and studied him for a moment. "That's not what I asked, Captain. I'm aware that changes have been implemented that some find challenging to their understanding of their duties." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "I want you to understand something clearly. Your oath is to the crown, not to any individual who happens to wear it temporarily." The conversation that followed would later be described by Morrison as the most important 20 minutes of his military career. Princess Anne spoke about duty, tradition, and the delicate balance between personal ambition and public service. She reminded him that the Royal Guard had, throughout history, sometimes found themselves in positions where they had to make difficult choices about where their ultimate loyalties lay. As the meeting concluded,
Princess Anne stood and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where Morrison's men were conducting the evening change of guard. "Captain," she said without turning around, "there may come a time when you and your men are asked to make choices that test your understanding of your oath. When that time comes, remember that your first duty is to the institution, not to any individual within it." Morrison left the meeting with his mind racing. He had served under enough commanders to recognize when he was being prepared for something significant. The Princess Royal's words were not just philosophical musings. They were practical guidance for challenges ahead. That evening, as Morrison briefed his senior staff on routine security updates, he noticed how carefully each man listened when he mentioned the importance of remembering their fundamental duties. No one asked direct questions, but the understanding that passed between them was clear. The Royal Guard was being forced to examine the very foundations of their service. Sergeant Williams approached Morrison after the briefing. "Sir, the men are talking," he said quietly. "They're wondering if things are going to change more than they already have." Morrison looked at his longtime colleague, seeing his own concerns reflected back at him. "What are they saying, Sergeant?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew. "They're remembering why they took the oath in the first place," Williams replied. "And some are wondering if the institution they swore to protect is the same one they're serving now." The question that Williams had raised was the same one that had been keeping him awake at night. The Royal Guard had always prided itself on being above politics, above the personal ambitions and petty squabbles that occasionally surfaced within royal circles. But recent events were testing that traditional neutrality. As the castle settled into its evening routine, Morrison walked the perimeter one final time. The familiar sounds of his guards going about their duties provided a comforting rhythm, but underneath it all, he could sense the change that was coming. Princess Anne's warning had been clear, and Morrison understood that his unit was about to face a test that would define not just their careers, but their understanding of what it truly meant to serve the crown. The next morning would bring decisions that no amount of training had prepared them for. But tonight, Morrison allowed himself a moment to appreciate the weight of the responsibility that rested on his shoulders and those of his men. They were the guardians of something precious and ancient, something that transcended any individual who might temporarily embody it. Tomorrow would test whether they truly understood what that meant. The emergency briefing was called for 6 in the morning, 3 hours before the usual shift change. Captain Morrison had barely slept, his mind churning over Princess Anne's words and the implications of what seemed to be building toward an inevitable confrontation. As his senior staff filed into the small conference room adjacent to the guard quarters, their faces reflected the same tension he felt. The message had come through official channels just after midnight. Queen Camilla would be hosting a private ceremony to formally recognize what she termed loyal service members within the royal household. The ceremony itself wasn't unusual, but the list of invitees was. Several long-serving staff members who had expressed concerns about recent protocol changes had been notably excluded, while newer appointees who had shown enthusiasm for Camilla's vision were prominently featured. More concerning was the directive that accompanied the ceremony announcement. All royal guards were to provide an additional formal acknowledgement of their service to Queen Camilla personally, separate from their existing oaths to the crown. The requirement was presented as a routine update to security protocols, but Morrison and his experienced staff recognized it for what it really was, a loyalty test. Sergeant Williams spread the official documents across the conference table. "The ceremony is scheduled for 2 this afternoon," he reported. "Full dress uniform required, and each guard captain is expected to present their unit for individual recognition." He paused, looking directly at Morrison. "Sir, the men are asking questions I'm not sure how to answer." Morrison studied the faces around the table. These were career military men who had dedicated their lives to service. Corporal Davies, who had served in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard. Lieutenant Foster, whose grandfather had served the royal family for 40 years. Master Sergeant Collins, who had been decorated for his service in Northern Ireland. Each had joined the Royal Guard because they believed in something greater than themselves. "What kind of questions?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he knew. "They want to know if this new oath supersedes the one they've already taken," Foster replied. "Some are wondering if accepting this recognition means they're choosing sides within the royal family itself."
The lieutenant's discomfort was evident. "Sir, we've always served the crown as an institution. This feels like we're being asked to serve an individual." Morrison had been dreading this moment since his conversation with Princess Anne. The Princess Royal's warning about having to make difficult choices was proving prophetic sooner than he had expected. He looked around the table at men he trusted with his life, men whose integrity he had never questioned. "Gentlemen," Morrison began carefully, "our oath has always been to the crown and the constitutional monarchy it represents. That oath doesn't change based on who occupies the throne or who happens to be married to the person who occupies the throne." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "What we're being asked to do today may test our understanding of that oath." The room fell silent as each man processed what their captain had just said. It was Sergeant Williams who finally spoke. "Sir, are you saying we should refuse the Queen's direct request?" Morrison chose his words carefully. "I'm saying that each of you needs to examine your conscience and your understanding of your duty. The Royal Guard has always stood apart from court politics, precisely because our loyalty is to something larger than any individual personality or agenda." Before anyone could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the meeting. Corporal Davies opened the door to find a palace aide standing stiffly in the hallway. "Captain Morrison, Her Royal Highness Princess Anne requests your immediate presence in the Rose Garden." Morrison excused himself, knowing that this unexpected summons was no coincidence. As he walked through the castle corridors, he passed several household staff members who avoided making eye contact. The tension that had been building for weeks was now palpable throughout the entire royal residence. Princess Anne was examining the autumn roses when Morrison arrived, but he could tell from her posture that gardening was not on her mind. She turned as he approached, her expression serious but not unkind. "Captain, I trust you've seen this morning's announcements," she said without preamble. Morrison confirmed that he had. "I want you to understand something clearly. What happens today will set a precedent that will echo through the institution for years to come." The Princess Royal walked slowly along the garden path, Morrison beside her. "The Royal Guard has always held a unique position," she continued. "You serve the crown, but you also serve as guardians of the traditions and values that make the monarchy worthy of the people's trust. Sometimes those two roles can come into conflict." Morrison listened carefully, understanding that he was receiving guidance that went far beyond military protocol. Princess Anne stopped beside a bench where she had often sat with her mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, during private conversations about the future of the monarchy. "My mother believed that the strength of the crown lay not in the power of any individual who wore it, but in the continuity of the institution itself," Princess Anne said. She understood that sometimes protecting the monarchy meant making difficult choices about the people within it. The princess fixed Morrison with the direct gaze that had made her both respected and occasionally feared throughout her life. "Captain, your men look to you for leadership. What you decide today will tell them whether their oath means what they thought it meant when they took it." Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Your Royal Highness, what would you have me do?" Princess Anne was quiet for a long moment, watching a gardener tend to the roses in the distance. "I would have you remember that the crown has survived for 1,000 years, not because it was always occupied by perfect people, but because good people understood when to say yes and when to say no." As Morrison returned to his duties, Princess Anne's words echoed in his mind. The morning passed in a blur of routine activities, but underneath the normal rhythm of palace life, everyone could sense the approaching storm. Guards who had worked together for years spoke in hushed tones. Palace staff moved through their duties with unusual efficiency, as if trying to complete everything important before an interruption they couldn't quite name. At 11:30, Morrison received another message. Queen Camilla wished to speak with him privately before the afternoon ceremony. As he made his way to the Queen's private sitting room, Morrison noticed that several senior household staff members were conspicuously absent from their usual posts. The message was clear. Lines were being drawn and everyone was being forced to choose a side. Queen Camilla was reviewing documents when Morrison was announced. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Captain Morrison, please sit down. I wanted to speak with you personally about this afternoon's ceremony." Morrison remained standing. "Your Majesty, how may I serve you?" The Queen's expression shifted slightly at his formal response. "Captain, I'm sure you understand how important it is for the security services to demonstrate their complete support for the current monarchy. Recent events have made it clear that we need to strengthen the bonds between the crown and those who protect it." Morrison listened as Queen Camilla explained her vision for a more responsive and personally connected royal security service. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was unmistakable. She wanted personal loyalty, not institutional service. "Your Majesty," Morrison replied when she had finished, "the Royal Guard has always prided itself on serving the crown with absolute dedication. Our loyalty has never been in question." "Of course not," Queen Camilla said quickly. "But surely you can see the value in reaffirming that loyalty in a more personal and direct way. The ceremony this afternoon will demonstrate to everyone that the Guard stands firmly behind the current monarchy." Morrison chose his next words very carefully. "Your Majesty, the Guard's loyalty to the crown is absolute and unwavering. That has been true for generations, and it remains true today." Something in Morrison's tone made Queen Camilla study him more closely. "Captain, I trust there won't be any complications with this afternoon's ceremony?" Morrison met her gaze steadily. "Your Majesty, the Royal Guard will conduct itself with the honor and dignity that has always characterized our service." As Morrison left the meeting, he understood that the careful diplomacy of his responses had been noted and would be remembered. The afternoon would bring a test that would define not just his career but the future relationship between the monarchy and the military services that protected it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to examine what they truly believed about duty, loyalty, and the institution they had all sworn to protect. The afternoon air carried an unusual tension as Captain Morrison and his men formed ranks in the castle's main courtyard. The ceremony was scheduled to begin promptly at 2 o'clock, but already Morrison could sense that something was different about this gathering. Palace staff moved with nervous efficiency, and even the usually confident household officials seemed uncertain about the protocols for this unprecedented event. Morrison had spent the lunch hour in deep conversation with his senior staff. The decision they faced was unlike anything in the Royal Guard's long history. They had always prided themselves on staying above the political currents that occasionally swept through royal circles. But today they were being asked to take a side in what amounted to a constitutional crisis. Sergeant Williams had been particularly troubled during their final briefing. "Sir," he had said quietly, "my grandfather served the royal family for 30 years. He always told me that the Guard's greatest strength was that we served the crown itself, not whoever happened to be wearing it at the moment. I keep thinking about what he would do in a situation like this." The memory of that conversation was fresh in Morrison's mind as he watched Queen Camilla emerge from the castle's main entrance. She was dressed in an elegant navy suit with the diamond brooch that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, a choice that many observers would later note as symbolically significant. Her entourage included several recently appointed advisors whose loyalty to her personally was well known throughout the palace. But Morrison's attention was drawn to another figure, who had appeared almost simultaneously from a side entrance. Princess Anne walked with the measured pace that characterized everything she did, her military bearing evident in every step. She wore the uniform of her honorary military appointments, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of her own service credentials and her deep connections to Britain's armed forces. The presence of both women at what was ostensibly Queen Camilla's ceremony created an immediate undercurrent of tension. Palace staff exchanged glances, uncertain about how to proceed. The original plan had called for Queen Camilla to receive the Guard's recognition without other senior royals present, but Princess Anne's arrival had changed the dynamic entirely. Morrison felt his radio crackle with activity as security coordinators tried to adapt to the unexpected development. But before anyone could make adjustments to the ceremony, Princess Anne had positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings directly. Her message was clear without being explicitly stated. The events of this afternoon would be witnessed by someone who understood both military tradition and constitutional principles. Queen Camilla began the ceremony with remarks about the importance of personal loyalty and the need for security services to demonstrate clear allegiance to the current monarchy. Her words were carefully crafted, but Morrison and his experienced staff could hear the subtext. This wasn't about institutional loyalty. It was about personal allegiance to her specifically. As the Queen spoke, Morrison noticed several things that reinforced his growing certainty about what was really happening. First, the guest list included primarily newer staff members and officials who had been appointed since King Charles's reign began. Long-serving household staff who might have questioned the appropriateness of such a ceremony were notably absent. Second, the media presence was larger than usual for an internal palace event, suggesting that the ceremony was intended to send a public message about who commanded loyalty within the royal household. Most significantly, Morrison observed Princess Anne's reactions throughout Queen Camilla's remarks. The Princess Royal's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but her military background was evident in the way she assessed everything she saw and heard. Morrison had served long enough to recognize when a senior officer was evaluating a situation that might require intervention. When Queen Camilla finished her opening remarks, she called for Captain Morrison to step forward and present his men for individual recognition. This was the moment Morrison had been dreading and preparing for since the early morning briefing. He could feel the eyes of his entire unit upon him as he approached the Queen's position. "Captain Morrison," Queen Camilla said with a smile that seemed forced, "please present your men so that they may individually acknowledge their personal loyalty to the crown as currently constituted." The phrase, "as currently constituted," was not part of any traditional military ceremony Morrison had ever participated in. It was a specific addition that fundamentally altered the nature of what his men were being asked to do. Instead of reaffirming their institutional oath, they were being asked to pledge personal allegiance to the specific individuals who currently held royal positions. Morrison turned to face his assembled guards, men he had trained with, served beside, and trusted with his life. In that moment, he thought about Princess Anne's words in the garden that morning, about the 1,000-year history of the crown and the men who had protected it through countless challenges. He thought about his own oath, taken 23 years earlier, and what it had meant to him then and what it meant to him now. "Your Majesty," Morrison said, turning back to face Queen Camilla, "the Royal Guard's oath is to the crown and the constitutional monarchy it represents. That oath is sacred, unchanging and absolute. We have served faithfully under that oath for generations, and we continue to serve under it today." The silence that followed Morrison's words seemed to stretch forever. Queen Camilla's expression shifted from expectation to confusion to something approaching anger. Palace staff members froze in place, uncertain about how to respond to what was clearly not the ceremony anyone had expected. But before Queen Camilla could respond, Princess Anne stepped forward. Her movement was deliberate and unmistakable, a senior royal asserting her presence at a moment of constitutional significance. She walked directly to where Morrison stood and positioned herself beside him, facing the assembled guards. "Captain Morrison," Princess Anne said in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, "you and your men have served the crown with distinction and honor. Your understanding of your oath and your commitment to the institution you protect has never been in question." The Princess Royal then turned to address the guards directly. "Gentlemen, your service to the crown represents the finest traditions of British military excellence. Your oath binds you to something greater than any individual, something that has endured for centuries and will endure for centuries to come. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed for years afterward." Without any formal command being given, every member of Morrison's unit came to attention and executed a precise, simultaneous bow toward Princess Anne. It was not a gesture of personal homage, but rather a recognition of what she represented: the institutional continuity and constitutional principles that they had all sworn to protect. The message was unmistakable. The Royal Guard had made their choice, and it was not the choice Queen Camilla had expected them to make. Queen Camilla stood frozen for several seconds, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Her advisors looked equally stunned, their carefully planned ceremony having become something entirely different from what they had intended. The media representatives present began to sense that they were witnessing something historically significant, though few fully understood the implications in the moment. Princess Anne maintained her position beside Morrison as the guards held their respectful bow. The tableau created a powerful visual statement about where institutional loyalty lay and who truly commanded the respect of Britain's military services. It was a moment that crystallized weeks of growing tension and made clear that the Royal Guard's understanding of their duty would not be compromised. regardless of pressure from any individual royal. As the ceremony came to an abrupt and unofficial end, Morrison knew that he and his men had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They had chosen to honor their understanding of their oath rather than bow to pressure to redefine it. The consequences of that choice would soon become apparent, but in that moment Morrison felt the quiet satisfaction of a soldier who had stood firm when it mattered most. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as the various participants began to disperse. The ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate personal loyalty had instead become a powerful affirmation of institutional integrity. The royal guard had spoken, not with words, but with the kind of disciplined action that had characterized their service for generations. The immediate aftermath of the ceremony brought a flurry of activity that Captain Morrison had anticipated but hoped to avoid. Within hours of the Guard's unexpected show of support for Princess Anne, palace communications were buzzing with coded messages and urgent consultations. Morrison found himself summoned to 3 separate meetings, each more tense than the last. The first summons came from Queen Camilla's private secretary, a sharp-featured man named Richardson, who had earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency since joining the royal household. Richardson's office was located in a part of the palace that most guards never saw, decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that spoke of power and influence. "Captain Morrison," Richardson began without pleasantries, "I think you understand why you're here." Morrison remained standing at attention, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. "Her Majesty is deeply concerned about what she perceives as insubordination within the Royal Guard. The ceremony this afternoon was meant to strengthen bonds of loyalty, not create opportunities for public displays of defiance." Morrison chose his words carefully. "Sir, the Royal Guard conducted itself with full military discipline throughout the ceremony. Our behavior was entirely consistent with our training and our oath." Richardson's expression hardened. "Captain, let's not play word games. You know perfectly well that your men's behavior this afternoon was a direct rejection of Her Majesty's authority. Such actions have consequences." The threat was clear, but Morrison had expected it. "Sir, if there are specific charges against myself or my men, I respectfully request that they be made through proper military channels. The Royal Guard has always operated under clear codes of conduct, and we're prepared to answer any legitimate questions about our service." What Richardson hadn't expected was Morrison's calm professionalism in the face of intimidation. The private secretary had grown accustomed to dealing with palace staff who could be easily pressured. But Morrison represented something different. A career military officer whose primary loyalty was to principles rather than personalities. The second meeting was with Sir Edward Hastings, the palace's senior constitutional advisor. Hastings was an elderly man who had served under 3 monarchs and understood better than most the delicate balance between tradition and change that kept the monarchy functioning. His office was filled with historical documents and legal texts that spoke to his deep knowledge of royal precedent. "Captain," Hastings began more gently than Richardson had, "I want to understand exactly what happened this afternoon. The reports I'm receiving are contradictory." Morrison appreciated Hastings' more measured approach. "Sir, Her Majesty requested that the Royal Guard provide individual acknowledgments of personal loyalty. My understanding of our oath is that our loyalty is to the Crown as an institution, not to specific individuals who may occupy royal positions." Hastings nodded slowly, making notes on a legal pad. "And when Princess Anne joined the ceremony?" "Sir, Her Royal Highness positioned herself with us in a way that demonstrated her support for our understanding of our constitutional role. My men responded with appropriate military courtesy to a senior member of the royal family." Hastings set down his pen and studied Morrison carefully. "Captain, you do understand that what you're describing could be interpreted as taking sides in what amounts to a family disagreement with constitutional implications." Morrison had been preparing for this question since the ceremony ended. "Sir, the Royal Guard has always stood apart from personal politics within the royal family. Our position today was consistent with that tradition. We serve the Crown, and we demonstrated respect for the member of the royal family who best represents the constitutional principles we're sworn to protect." The third meeting was the most significant, though it came in an unexpected form. As Morrison completed his evening rounds, he found Princess Anne waiting for him in the guard's common room. This was unprecedented. Senior royals simply didn't visit the working areas where guards relaxed between shifts. Her presence there sent a powerful message to every guard in the building. "Captain," Princess Anne said as Morrison entered the room, "walk with me." And it super-started programs to be frequently corridors. Past portraits of monarchs who had grappled with their own constitutional challenges. As they walked, the Princess Royal spoke quietly about the events of the afternoon and their implications for the future. "What happened today will be remembered," she said, "not just within palace walls, but in the broader context of how our constitutional monarchy adapts to changing times. Your men showed remarkable discipline in a situation that had no clear precedent." Morrison listened carefully, understanding that he was receiving guidance that went far beyond immediate concerns. Princess Anne continued, "The Royal Guard has always occupied a unique position. You're military personnel, but you serve within a civilian institution. You take orders, but you also serve as guardians of traditions that transcend any individual's personal agenda." They paused at a window overlooking the courtyard where the afternoon's events had unfolded. "Captain, there are going to be consequences for what happened today. Some will be immediate and obvious. Others may not become apparent for months or even years. But I want you to understand that your actions today were both necessary and correct." Princess Anne then shared something that Morrison would never repeat, but would never forget. She spoke about conversations with her late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, about the challenges the monarchy would face in the coming decades. The late Queen had understood that the institution's survival would depend not on the ambitions of any individual royal, but on the integrity of the people who served it. "The crown belongs to the people of Britain," Princess Anne said. "Those of us who wear it are temporary custodians. The Royal Guard exists to protect that principle, not to serve the personal interests of whoever happens to hold royal titles at any given moment." As their conversation concluded, Morrison understood that he had received not just support for his actions, but guidance for the challenges ahead. The events of the afternoon had established a precedent that would influence royal military relations for years to come. But the immediate consequences began within hours. By evening, several senior palace officials who were known supporters of Queen Camilla's vision for a more personally loyal court had requested meetings with Morrison's superiors. Richardson had begun drafting memoranda questioning the Royal Guard's fitness for duty. There were whispers about potential transfers, disciplinary actions, and restructuring of security protocols. More significantly, word of the afternoon's events had begun to spread beyond palace walls. Senior military officers who had served with Morrison during his earlier career began making discreet inquiries about his situation. Veterans organizations that had always supported the royal family started asking questions about whether the monarchy was honoring its traditional relationship with Britain's military services. The story that emerged in various forms over the following days was one of military integrity confronting political ambition. Morrison and his guards had faced a test of their fundamental beliefs about service and duty, and they had chosen to honor their understanding of their oath rather than bow to pressure to redefine it. Within the royal household, the afternoon's events had crystallized tensions that had been building for months. Staff members who had been uncertain about where they stood in the evolving royal hierarchy now understood that lines had been drawn. The choice between institutional loyalty and personal allegiance was no longer theoretical. Princess Anne's public support for Morrison's position had given legitimacy to concerns that many had felt, but few had dared to express. The Royal Guard's disciplined response to an unprecedented situation had demonstrated that Britain's military values remained unchanged, even within the rarefied atmosphere of royal service. As Morrison prepared for what he knew would be a challenging period ahead, he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his men had stood firm when it mattered most. They had honored their oath, supported their understanding of constitutional principles, and demonstrated the kind of integrity that had made the Royal Guard respected throughout the military community. The consequences of their choice would soon become apparent, but Morrison was confident that history would judge their actions as correct. The Royal Guard had spoken, and their message was clear. Their loyalty belonged to the Crown as an institution, not to any individual who might seek to claim it for personal purposes. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes that rippled through the royal household like stones thrown into still water. Captain Morrison had expected retaliation, but the form it took surprised him with its complexity and far-reaching implications. What had begun as a simple question of military protocol had evolved into a broader examination of the monarchy's relationship with the institutions that supported it. The first indication of the new reality came in the form of administrative changes that seemed minor but carried significant meaning. The Royal Guard's duty rosters were modified to reduce their visibility during Queen Camilla's public appearances. New security protocols were implemented that effectively created separate systems for different members of the royal family. Most tellingly, several ceremonial duties that had traditionally been performed by Morrison's unit were reassigned to other security services. Richardson, Queen Camilla's private secretary, had been busy in the weeks since the ceremony. He had cultivated relationships with officials in the Ministry of Defense who were sympathetic to the view that military personnel serving in royal households should demonstrate clearer personal loyalty to current occupants of royal positions. These officials began raising questions about the Royal Guard's command structure and whether their traditional autonomy was appropriate in modern circumstances. But Richardson had underestimated the broader implications of challenging the Royal Guard's institutional independence. Within days of the first official inquiries, Morrison began receiving phone calls from unexpected sources. Retired generals who had served with distinction in various conflicts expressed their support for his position. Veterans organizations issued carefully worded statements about the importance of maintaining military integrity within royal service. Even some members of parliament began asking discreet questions about whether the government was adequately protecting military personnel from political pressure within royal households. The most significant support came from an unexpected source: other European royal families. District colleges of territory are involved in some of the chartered races to take over the system of Germany and military advisors. This is the book. It's about history, was in present directly in democratic societies of gorgeous and impact, present and individually in distribution integrity. Princess Anne had not been idle during this period. Her extensive network of military contacts had proven invaluable in building support for Morrison's position. More importantly, she had begun making public appearances that subtly reinforced the message delivered during the ceremony. When she attended a veterans' dinner in London, she spoke about the importance of military personnel maintaining their professional integrity regardless of pressure from civilian authorities. When she visited a military academy, she emphasized the sacred nature of military oaths and the courage required to honor them in difficult circumstances. These public statements were carefully crafted to avoid direct criticism of Queen Camilla, but their meaning was clear to anyone who understood the context. Princess Anne was using her considerable influence to demonstrate that Morrison's position had support at the highest levels of the royal family. The broader public remained largely unaware of the specific details of the ceremony and its aftermath. But journalists with expertise in royal affairs had begun asking questions. The palace's press office found itself dealing with inquiries about changes in security protocols and whether there were tensions within the royal household. The official responses were diplomatically vague, but the very fact that such questions were being asked indicated that word of the controversy was spreading. Morrison's personal situation became more complex as the weeks passed. He received an offer to transfer to a prestigious position with the Ministry of Defense that would have effectively removed him from royal service while advancing his career. The offer was presented as a reward for his exemplary service, but Morrison understood it as an attempt to resolve the situation by removing him from the palace environment altogether. After consulting with Princess Anne, Morrison declined the transfer. His reasoning was both personal and constitutional. Accepting the transfer would have sent a message that military personnel who stood firm on matters of principle could be quietly moved aside when their positions became inconvenient. It would have validated the view that royal service was subject to personal political considerations rather than institutional standards. The decision to remain in his position brought additional pressure, but it also clarified the fundamental issues at stake. Morrison was no longer just defending his own understanding of his oath. He was defending the principle that military personnel serving the crown should not be subject to political manipulation by individual royals seeking personal loyalty. The resolution, when it came, was both unexpected and elegant. King Charles himself, who had remained officially neutral throughout the controversy, requested a private meeting with Morrison. The meeting was arranged through Princess Anne's office, away from the officials who had been pressing for Morrison's removal. King Charles received Morrison in his private study, a room lined with books on history and constitutional law that reflected the king's scholarly interests. The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction Morrison had experienced with a monarch. King Charles spoke not as a royal giving commands, but as someone genuinely seeking to understand the constitutional implications of recent events. "Captain Morrison," the king began, "I want to understand your perspective on recent events. The reports I've received present conflicting interpretations of what occurred during the ceremony." Morrison had prepared for this moment since the ceremony, but he found the king's approach disarming in its directness. "Your Majesty, the Royal Guard has always understood our oath to be to the crown as an institution, not to any individual who may occupy royal positions. When we felt that understanding was being challenged, we sought to demonstrate our commitment to constitutional principles." "And Princess Anne's role in these events?" "Your Majesty, Her Royal Highness positioned herself with us in a way that demonstrated her understanding of constitutional principles. We responded with appropriate military courtesy to a senior member of the royal family who clearly understood the importance of institutional integrity." The king was quiet for several minutes, considering Morrison's words. When he spoke again, his tone was measured but decisive. "Captain, the crown has endured for centuries because it has been served by people who understood that their loyalty was to something greater than any individual personality. Your actions and those of your men reflect that understanding." What King Charles said next would remain private, but its implications became clear in the days that followed. New guidelines were issued through official channels that clarified the relationship between royal household staff and individual members of the royal family. The guidelines emphasized that all royal service personnel, including security services, served the crown as an institution, rather than specific individuals within the royal family. The guidelines also established clear protocols for situations where individual royals might request personal loyalty that could conflict with institutional duties. Such requests were to be referred to the monarch personally, ensuring that constitutional principles would be maintained even when personal relationships became strained. Queen Camilla's response to these developments was diplomatically correct but privately furious. She continued to fulfill her royal duties without public complaint, but those close to her noted a marked coolness toward military personnel and a preference for civilian staff who owed their positions directly to her patronage. Richardson found his influence significantly diminished as the new guidelines made clear that attempts to pressure royal service personnel into personal loyalty were inappropriate. Several of his initiatives were quietly shelved, and his access to decision-making processes was noticeably reduced. For Morrison and his men, the resolution brought vindication, but also ongoing responsibility. They had successfully defended their understanding of their oath, but they now carried the additional burden of knowing that their actions had established precedents that would influence royal military relations for generations to come. The final chapter of the immediate crisis came during a state dinner 6 weeks after the original ceremony. Morrison was assigned to his traditional position as head of security for the event, a clear signal that his status within the royal household had been restored. As he watched Queen Camilla fulfill her ceremonial duties with professional competence, Morrison reflected on the path that had brought them to this point. The evening proceeded without incident, but as the royal family departed the dining hall, Princess Anne paused beside Morrison. "Captain," she said quietly, "well done." The simple words carried the weight of institutional approval and personal gratitude. As Morrison completed his final rounds that evening, he understood that the crisis had fundamentally changed the royal household in ways that would become apparent only with time. The Royal Guard had demonstrated that military integrity could not be compromised, even within the unique environment of royal service. Princess Anne had shown that senior royals could support constitutional principles even when it created personal complications. Most importantly, the monarchy itself had demonstrated its capacity to address internal tensions while maintaining its broader institutional integrity. The story of the ceremony would be remembered not as a moment of conflict, but as a demonstration of the values that allowed Britain's constitutional monarchy to adapt and endure. Captain Morrison and his men had faced an unprecedented test, and had emerged with their principles intact. They had served the crown with honor, and in doing so, they had helped ensure that future generations of guards would understand what that service truly meant.